Thomas Brennan had learned to speak more to horses than to people. At 43, he lived alone on a sprawling ranch in the high desert of New Mexico, where the land stretched endlessly under skies so blue they hurt to look at. His days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons: wake before dawn, tend the horses, mend fences, watch the sun set from his porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He'd inherited the ranch from his father 15 years ago, along with the old man's silent disposition and his habit of keeping the world at arm's length. The neighboring ranchers knew Thomas as a good man, honest and hardworking, but also as someone who'd rather ride 20 miles alone than sit through 20 minutes of small talk at the general store. The shyness hadn't always defined him. Once, as a young man, Thomas had been engaged to a schoolteacher named Sarah. They'd made plans, dreamed of filling the ranch house with children and laughter. But Sarah had died suddenly from pneumonia the winter before their wedding, and something in Thomas had closed up like a night-blooming flower at dawn. He'd built walls around his heart, stone by stone, until even kindness couldn't find its way through. People stopped trying to reach him after a while. They'd nod respectfully when they saw him in town, exchange pleasantries about the weather or cattle prices, then let him return to his solitude. It was easier that way, Thomas told himself. Easier than risking that kind of pain again. On a blazing afternoon in late August, when the heat shimmered off the desert floor in silvery waves, Thomas was in the corral working with a young mare when he saw the dust cloud approaching on the dirt road. Visitors were rare, most people who had business with him called first, and he had no family left to speak of. He watched as an old pickup truck rattled up his drive, painting the air brown with dust. Two Apache women emerged from the vehicle, moving with a dignity that made the worn-out truck seem inconsequential. The older woman might have been 60, with silver threading through her long black hair, which she wore in a traditional bun. The younger woman, perhaps 30, carried herself with the same quiet strength. Between them, holding both their hands, was a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Thomas removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his forehead, his heart already beginning to beat faster with the anxiety that always came when he had to interact with strangers. He walked toward them slowly, trying to think of what to say, how to excuse himself politely from whatever they wanted. Up close, he could see the weariness in the older woman's eyes, the kind that came from traveling long distances with heavy burdens. The little girl stared at him with enormous dark eyes, partially hidden behind the younger woman's leg. She wore a faded yellow dress and clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. "Mr. Brennan," the older woman said, her voice carrying the musical lilt of her native language beneath the English words. "My name is Margaret Whitefeather, and this is my daughter, Ruth. We've come a long way to speak with you. May we have a moment of your time?" Thomas nodded, unable to find his voice, and gestured toward the porch where there was shade. His mind raced. How did they know his name? What could they possibly want from him? He offered them water, which they accepted gratefully, and they all sat in the wooden chairs his father had built decades ago. The little girl sat on Ruth's lap, still watching Thomas with those cautious, knowing eyes that seemed too old for her face. Margaret began to speak, and Thomas listened with growing astonishment. She told him about her grandson, Joseph Whitefeather, who had been Thomas's friend in the 3rd grade. Thomas remembered Joseph, a quiet, clever boy who'd sat next to him in Mrs. Henderson's class. They'd been close that year, sharing lunches and playing together at recess, two shy kids who'd found easy companionship in each other. Then Joseph's family had moved away to Arizona, and Thomas had never seen him again. That had been 35 years ago, a lifetime that seemed to belong to a different person entirely. "Joseph spoke of you often," Margaret said, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Even as a grown man, he would remember the kindness you showed him that year. You were the only child who didn't make fun of his accent, who shared your books with him, who stood up for him when others were cruel." Thomas felt his face flush. He barely remembered those small acts, they'd seemed like nothing at the time, just what any decent person would do. But Margaret continued, her voice growing softer. "Joseph became a good man. He joined the army, served his country with honor. He married a wonderful woman, Maria, and they had this little one, Lily. The little girl's name was Lily. Thomas found himself looking at her again, seeing how she'd nestled closer to Ruth, how her small fingers gripped the worn rabbit. Margaret's voice cracked slightly as she went on. 2 months ago, Joseph and Maria were in a car accident. They didn't survive. Ruth is my daughter, Lily's aunt, but she works 2 jobs in Phoenix just to keep food on the table. I'm raising 3 other grandchildren on my pension. We've tried, Mr. Brennan, but the truth is we can barely manage as it is. We don't have room, don't have resources. The state wants to place Lily in foster care, with strangers who won't know her family, her heritage, her story. Thomas felt as though the ground was tilting beneath him. He gripped the arms of his chair, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. They weren't here to ask for money or a favor. They were here to ask for something impossible. Margaret leaned forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears. In Joseph's papers, we found a letter he'd written but never sent, years ago. In it, he wrote that if anything ever happened to him, he would want his children raised by someone with a good heart, someone who understood what it meant to be kind when kindness wasn't easy. He named you, Thomas Brennan. Said you were the best friend he'd ever had, even if it was just for 1 year. Said you were the kind of man who'd do right by a child. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Him. Raise a child. He lived alone, barely spoke to anyone, didn't know the first thing about being a father. He opened his mouth to refuse, to explain how impossible this was, how they'd made a terrible mistake. But then Lily looked directly at him for the first time, and something in her expression stopped him cold. It wasn't hope he saw there, it was resignation, the look of a child who'd already learned that the world was full of disappointments and that adults couldn't be counted on. She expected him to say no. She was already bracing herself for another rejection, another loss. Thomas began, his throat tight. I don't know anything about raising kids. I live alone. I'm not good with people. Ruth spoke for the first time, her voice gentle. We're not asking you to be perfect, Mr. Brennan. We're asking you to be present. Lily needs stability, needs someone who'll keep her safe and let her grow. She needs someone who'll care. Margaret added, we wouldn't ask this if we had any other choice. But we also wouldn't ask this if we didn't believe you were the right person. Joseph trusted you with his most precious treasure. Can you at least consider it? Thomas looked out at his ranch, at the endless expanse of land that had been his refuge and his prison for so long. He thought about his quiet life, his careful routines, the walls he'd built to protect himself from ever being hurt again. Saying yes would demolish all of that. It would mean chaos and noise and vulnerability and risk. It would mean opening his heart to another person, to a child who'd already lost everything. It would mean the possibility of more pain than he could imagine. Every logical fiber of his being screamed that this was madness, that he should politely decline and send them on their way. But he also thought about Joseph, that small boy who'd been his friend so long ago, who'd somehow carried the memory of a few kind acts across decades. He thought about what his own father might have done, despite his quiet nature, his father who'd once taken in a stranded family during a blizzard and given them his own bed. He thought about Sarah, who'd loved him for his gentle heart, who'd always said he had more to give the world than he believed. And he thought about little Lily, orphaned and scared, being passed from stranger to stranger because the people who loved her simply didn't have enough to keep her. How long can you stay? Thomas heard himself ask, and the words seemed to come from somewhere beyond his conscious mind. Margaret's face transformed with cautious hope. We have 3 days before we have to return to Arizona. We hoped we might leave Lily here for a trial period, if you're willing. Give you both time to adjust, see if this could work. Thomas stood up, his legs unsteady, and walked to the edge of the porch. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the desert in shades of amber and rose. 3 days to decide if he could completely transform his life. 3 days to figure out if he had it in him to be what this child needed. He turned back to them, looking at Lily's small, solid The first night was impossibly hard. Margaret and Ruth stayed in town at a small motel, wanting to give Thomas and Lily space to begin adjusting to each other, but promising to return first thing in the morning. Thomas showed Lily to the spare bedroom that had once been his mother's sewing room, which still smelled faintly of lavender and old fabric. He'd cleaned it hastily before they arrived, removing boxes and dusting surfaces, but it was still bare and unwelcoming, just a bed with plain white sheets and a single dresser with a cracked mirror. Lily had stood in the doorway, clutching her rabbit, looking impossibly small in the big empty room. "Is it okay?" Thomas had asked awkwardly, and she'd nodded without speaking. She hadn't spoken a single word since arriving, though Margaret had assured him she could talk, she just chose not to, not since her parents had died. The silence between them felt massive, an ocean neither knew how to cross. Thomas had made them dinner, simple fare of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, which Lily had picked at without enthusiasm. He tried to make conversation, asking about school and favorite colors and whether she liked horses, but each question was met with a small shrug or a barely perceptible nod. Finally, he'd given up, and they'd eaten in a silence that felt more suffocating than any Thomas had ever experienced alone. After dinner, he'd helped her brush her teeth, at least, he'd stood helplessly in the bathroom doorway while she did it herself with the pink toothbrush Ruth had brought, and tucked her into bed. "Good night, Lily," he'd said, his voice sounding strange and formal even to his own ears. She'd looked at him with those enormous eyes, then rolled over to face the wall, the rabbit clutched to her chest. Thomas had retreated to his own room and sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, wondering what on earth he'd gotten himself into. The house felt different with another person in it, the silence somehow louder, more alive with possibility and terror. He barely slept. Every creak of the old house made him bolt upright, worried that Lily was awake and scared, that she needed something and he wouldn't know what to do. Around 3 in the morning, he finally got up and quietly checked on her. In the pale moonlight streaming through the window, he could see her curled in a tight ball, her face streaked with dried tears. His heart cracked a little at the sight. This poor child had lost everything, and here he was, a stranger who didn't even know how to comfort her. He stood there for a long moment, feeling utterly inadequate, before returning to his own bed where he stared at the ceiling until dawn. Margaret and Ruth arrived early the next morning, and Thomas felt an embarrassing rush of relief at seeing them. At least they knew what they were doing. Margaret had brought bags of Lily's belongings, clothes and a few toys, some books and photographs in frames. They spent the morning helping Thomas set up the bedroom properly, hanging curtains Ruth had bought in town, arranging the toys on the dresser, putting up pictures of Joseph and Maria so Lily would always see their faces. Margaret worked with quiet efficiency, occasionally murmuring to Lily in a mixture of English and Apache, explaining what they were doing and why. In the afternoon, Margaret took Thomas aside while Ruth played with Lily in the newly decorated room. They sat on the porch, and Margaret explained things Thomas had never thought about, the importance of routine for a traumatized child, the need for patience when dealing with grief, the way children Lily's age processed loss differently than adults. "She's not ignoring you to be difficult," Margaret said gently. "She's protecting herself. Everyone she's ever loved has left her, one way or another. Right now, she's waiting for you to leave too. She won't let herself trust you until she believes you'll stay." "How do I show her I'll stay?" Thomas asked, feeling overwhelmed. Margaret smiled, a sad, knowing expression. "By staying. By being there every morning when she wakes up, every night when she goes to sleep. By being consistent and reliable and present, even when it's hard, even when she pushes you away. She will push you away, Thomas. It's what hurt children do. They test you to see if you're really going to stay. You have to decide now, before she tests you, that you're all in. Because if you're not, if there's any part of you that's going to give up when things get difficult, it's better to know now." Thomas sat with that question for a long moment, watching the horses graze in the distant pasture. Was he all in? Could he be? He thought about his life before yesterday, the loneliness he'd convinced himself was peace, the emptiness he'd mistaken for safety. Then he thought about Lily's tear-stained face in the moonlight, about the way she'd looked at him expecting rejection. "I'm all in," he said finally, and as he said it, he felt something shift inside himself, like a door he'd kept locked for 15 years finally swinging open. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm all in." The second day was marginally better, if only because Thomas had lower expectations. He made pancakes for breakfast, which Lily ate in the same careful silence. Afterward, he asked if she'd like to see the horses, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of interest in her eyes. They walked out to the corral together, and Thomas introduced her to each horse by name: Sage, the old gelding who'd been his father's favorite; Juniper, the young mare he'd been training; Scout, the gentle giant who loved peppermints. Lily stood at the fence, watching them with an intensity that suggested she was taking in every detail. On impulse, Thomas went into the barn and came back with a small bucket of apple slices. He showed Lily how to hold her palm flat, how to let the horses take the treats gently. She was hesitant at first, but when Sage lowered his great head and delicately lipped an apple slice from her small hand, Thomas saw the tiniest hint of a smile ghost across her face. It was gone in an instant, but it had been there. They spent an hour at the fence, feeding the horses, and Thomas talked to them the way he always did, telling them about his day, asking them questions, narrating what he was doing. He realized he was including Lily in these one-sided conversations naturally, without thinking about it, and somehow that felt easier than trying to talk to her directly. That evening, Ruth had an idea. She'd brought a collection of beads and string, traditional Apache patterns that her mother had taught her. She sat up at the kitchen table and began making a bracelet, explaining each symbol and its meaning as she worked. Lily watched from across the table, and after a while, Ruth slid some beads and string across to her. "Want to try?" she asked simply. Lily hesitated, then reached out and began selecting beads with careful deliberation. Thomas watched from where he was preparing dinner, amazed at the focus in the little girl's face. She didn't make a bracelet, she just arranged and rearranged the beads in different patterns, but her shoulders had relaxed, and some of the terrible tension had left her small body. On the third day, Margaret and Ruth had to leave. The goodbye was heartbreaking. Lily clung to Ruth with desperate strength, silent tears streaming down her face, and Thomas felt his own eyes burning as he watched. Margaret hugged him tightly, whispering, "You're doing the right thing. Be patient. Love her through the hard parts." And then they were gone, driving away in their dust cloud truck, and Thomas was standing alone with a grief-stricken 5-year-old who wouldn't look at him, wouldn't speak, who had retreated so far into herself he didn't know how to reach her. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Thomas's life. Lily barely ate. She didn't sleep well, often waking with nightmares that left her shaking and silent. She followed the routines Thomas established: wake up, breakfast, time with the horses, lunch, quiet time, dinner, bedtime, but she did it all like a ghost, present but not really there. Thomas felt himself floundering, second-guessing every decision, wondering if he was making things worse. He called Margaret every night, describing the day, asking for advice, sometimes just needing to hear that he wasn't failing completely. But slowly, incrementally, things began to shift. It started with the horses. Lily began asking to go see them, not with words, but by walking toward the corral and looking back at him expectantly. Thomas would follow, and they'd spend hours there together, him doing his work, her watching or helping in small ways. He taught her how to brush Sage's coat, how to clean out hooves, how to fill water troughs. She was a natural with the animals, gentle and intuitive, and Thomas found himself talking more freely out there, with the horses as intermediaries. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Margar